Hey guys, it's Colin here. Welcome to an introduction series on making games with Bevy 17.2. I'm also new to Bevy, so we will be learning this together as you follow along. And in today's video, this is going to be like a great introduction if you're also new like me. Some of the concepts covered in this video are systems, plugins, entities, apps, and many more. We will use these concepts to create basic 3D scenes, and in the next episode, I'll help you organize your project. And now we take a look at the unofficial Bevy cheatbook. This is an amazing resource to push your learning, as this has basically most of the things you need. All you have to do is go through this list, find what you want to learn about, and then apply those in your code. And then we also have the Bevy documentation in their GitHub. These two main components is what we're going to use for all our learning as we continue this series, and you should definitely check it out. To get started with, you need to make sure that you have Rust installed. Below will show the instructions for Windows install. Normally use VS Code. And once you have this installed, which I'm not going to do because I already do, you're going to use cargo new, and then we're going to call it project 1. And this is how we're going to create our new project for our Bevy game. Once we create that, we can enter that. And this will be very similar to VS Code, where we need to add it to our project. So we're going to use cargo add Bevy. And then once we have that installed, we need to make sure that we have our dependencies installed. So on Linux Ubuntu, we're going to download these exact dependencies. As you can see, they're already installed on my machine. And below will show the instructions for VS Code if you're using Windows. And now we can start. By opening our project directory, we can use ls on Linux. On VS Code, you should see it right away. So first of all, we have our cargo totem. This is going to be where we define our cargo dependencies. And we can see that Beverly is just a cargo dependency, and we're using 17.2. Our project name is project 1, version is for Rust is this version, and edition's 2024, and today's 2025, so I'm wondering when that's going to come out. So now we know where that's at. That's where we're going to add cargo dependencies later on. For now, we're just going to stick with Beverly. So let's open up our main RS. So this is going to be under RC, and then we're going to have main RS. So when it comes to Rust, fn defines our main function, and our function is called main. And when we run this, it prints hello world. So we're going to delete hello world because we don't need it anymore. But first, let me show you how to run a program. So to run a Rust program, you type cargo run. Cargo run builds the program, and then it runs at the same time, so you don't need to do both. See how it runs right away? Because it's a very short program. So now let's open up our file again. So the first thing we need to do is we need to include the Beverly library. This will bring all the essential functions and variables that Beverly uses, which is there's just so much so far. So we're going to use preclude, and this is going to give us all of the Beverly's essential functions from what we included in cargo. Now let's delete hello world, as we don't need it anymore, unfortunately. So to define Beverly in our main program, we're going to start with app nil, and then we're going to start with all the things we're going to have. So we have, the first thing we have to start with is plugins. Plugins is how we bring in Beverly's external functions. So this is going to include things such as the screen that renders in your program, the time variables, and all of the other things you really want to have. So we're going to call it default plugins. Later on in the video, in the future videos, we're going to show you how to define your own plugins. This is going to be helpful for making your program very clean. As you can see, default plugins has a lot of stuff, and all you have to do is type in default plugins. So now let's add our system. So systems is how we establish our setup. So startup is all the things that run once when the program starts. This is like your where you start your program on Arduino. And then we also have add systems, and this one's going to be called update. So this is like your loop. This run whatever functions you put in here run continuously, and each function is in its own threaded process. So it makes it very easy to add more things as you go. And then the last thing we have to do is tell Beverly to run it. So you have to do run, and then that's all you have to define right here. For now, we're gonna just cross this out because we're gonna be establishing how to create basic scenes. We don't need anything running dynamic like act over and over right now. And so we're just gonna have setup. And keep in mind that add systems expect 2 inputs. So you have to add another bracket here. And right here is where we're gonna put all our functions that start when the program starts. So let's start by defining, we're gonna define our floor and then our camera and then so we can see what we're actually creating, and then we're gonna move on to our lighting and then a character so we can have somebody to be on our base. So let's start by defining our circular base. So we're gonna use a regular Rust function. So you start with function and then you call spawn floor, as you can see here. And before we even get into defining our function, we do need to bring in Beverly's tools that they have. So the first thing we're going to start with is commands. Commands is going to allow us to spawn in our floor. That's why we need that. And then the next thing we need is meshes, because our floor is a mesh. This will bring in all of Beverly's meshes. So you do meshes, resmute. I do encourage you to figure out how many type of like where the repo is all of these meshes are, so you can test them out and see what Beverly got for us. And then we also need to bring in materials. So materials is just going to bring in all of Beverly's materials, and this is like a subcategory underneath assets. So you start with assets, just like this, and then we're going to do standard materials, and then we're going to close that off here. Let's now define our function now. So to make this clean, we're going to put all the parameters of our function within this variable right here. This is just to make the program a lot cleaner. So we're going to start with our mesh, because we're using a 3D mesh. We're going to do 3D, and then we're going to do meshes dot add, and then we're going to use a circular base for our mesh, and nil, and then 4.0 defines the radius of our platform. No clue if it's meters or centimeters, but it is pretty big enough, and you can make this bigger if you like. And then we're going to do meshes, mesh, material, 3D, as this is a 3D material. And then we're going to do materials dot add, and then this is where we're going to establish our color of a material. So we're just going to use a white platform just to keep it simple, and have a color difference between our dark background. Color difference. So, and then we're going to do transform. This is actually where we define our platform's like position in this coordinate system. At the moment, we're going to have it just at the origin, as that's how it will be by default. So we're going to do from rotation, and then we're going to do X, and this just defines our platform's coordinate system. So F32, this will definitely be worth looking into, figuring out how it works. I do know that the y-axis is actually the z-axis. Like if you've taken calculus, z-axis is always up and down, but it's replaced with the y-axis in Beverly. So it might be a little bit confusing to start off. So now we have our function, our variable defined. now we can spawn it in using our commands from before. So do commands spawn and then floor. and that will tell Beverly to spawn on your floor. So now that we have that defined, let's include this in our app. So when we go back to apps, right here, apps, and we'll type spawn lowercase floor. This will spawn our floor. And now we need a camera because we do have a floor, but we actually have no way of seeing our floor at all. So now we need to define our camera. So we're gonna spawn camera, and then we're gonna do mute. And this time we're only gonna bring in commands, as we don't need our assets or standing materials this time around. All we need is commands so that we can spawn in our camera. So we're gonna do let camera equal, and then we're gonna do camera 3D, as this is a 3D game, and then default. So we're using the default camera. There's probably a lot more out there. So transform, and this time transform is actually going to define the position of our camera. This will actually be interesting to see if we can change this like dynamically, as we can actually put in the numbers. So negative 2.5 on the x-axis, 4.5 on the y-axis, and then we have 9.0 on the z-axis. And then we're going to define the axis that it's on, as we're going to use the one that's provided by Beverly. So it's vector 3, 0, and then vector 3. And it has a capital Y, so I'm assuming that's like what the y-axis is, being like the up and down section. So now we can close off our function, our variable, and now it's just spawning in. So we're going to do commands dot spawn, and then we can spawn in our camera just like that. So now that we have this, let's test our program out. Make sure you turn these brackets. So to do that, we gotta add it on our add system startup. So we need to spawn camera, and now we have everything here. So let's run our program. Now let's run our program. So we're gonna use cargo run as before. When we run it, we're gonna have a window pop up. And as we can see right here from our program, it's very simple. We just have our camera, and then we have our circular white base, but as you can see, it looks very dark, and that's because there's no lighting. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to add some lighting and then our character to our game. Next, we'll add characters and lighting to bring scene to life. Check out part 2 when it comes out. Okay, the next thing we need to do is add our character and then also lighting so we can see the color of our objects. So let's start with the light. So just as before, we're going to define our Rust function, before with f, n, and then we're going to call this spawn light. So that'll be pretty obvious to other people what it is. So we're going to add our commands again as before, because we need to be able to spawn our object in, and after that we can start getting into lights. So commands, and then we're going to declare our variable lights. So it's called let light equal, and then let's define it right here. So it's going to be called point light, which is also a Rust type of like function here. You got to put some parameters. So it's going to be shadows enabled, and we're going to set that to true so we can have some shadows in our game, which would be pretty nice. And then next thing we need to do is just the defaults that point light gets with Beverly. So default, and then we can close it off right here. And then the next thing we need to do is spawn in our light. So to do that, the position of it. So we're going to do transform XYZ, and we're going to have this at 4.8, so you can see it's a little bit high up into the air. And then we're going to do 4 for the Z position, and then that's it for the position. Now let's wrap up our function, our variable, and then let's spawn it in. Commands spawn, and then type in light, and then we need the closing bracket at the end here. Okay, and now let's create our character. So our character in our game is just going to be a cube for the moment. But as you learn Rust, we will switch this out with a regular user. But let's start with our character just so we have something. So we're going to spawn with spawn character and then an open bracket. And just as before, we need our commands and then command. And then we also need meshes since we're dealing with a 3D object here. So we need to bring our meshes from Beverly, resmute, asset, and then we're going to bring in Beverly's mesh assets, which includes the cube. And then we also need the materials because we want to make this color a certain type of color mesh. We will probably do something like, I don't know, but we'll see. So res materials, res mute, and then we do assets again, and standard material, and then we close this off here. Now we can start defining the contents. So we're gonna let player equal open bracket here, and then we're gonna do mesh 3D and then meshes add, and then we're gonna do a cuboid. This is the shape that Beverly provides us, and then we define the length of each side of our cube. So we're just gonna do one unit for each side. Don't know what units, we'll have to look that up for next video. And mesh, you could probably define them yourself, but at the moment we're just using 1 something, and then materials add, and then this is where you can define the color of your mesh. This one's going to be a little bit different where we're going to use numbers for each type of color, and as they mix we'll get something else. So we can just use string 124, 144, 255, and then we can close this off. I think it's supposed to be red, blue, green, and then we also need to tell Beverly where we want this. So we're going to use transform once again, X, Y, Z, and then on the x-axis we're going to do it 0, but on the y-axis, as we remember, that's the height. Because this cube is 1 unit in every direction and it's centered, half of it is going to be below the platform and half of it's going to be above. So because the positioning starts at the center of our object, and then we'll do 0 for our z coordinate, and then we can close this off right here, and now we can spawn in our player. So spawn player, and then we close off our function right here. Okay, now that we have our character defined, we also need to add these to our system that we're starting when our game starts. So we're gonna go add spawn, was it light? And then we have spawn character, and that should start all of our functions when the program runs. And let's see if it runs. So you can see we have our cube that's been generated, and we can see the white color of our platform because of the light we added, and that's it. And thank you for watching my video today. I appreciate you watching to the end, and have a good day.